Thank you for the remarks from our opening speakers and our organisers. I particularly agree with Chris Butler's point about the lack of an external enemy causing a little bit of an existential intellectual crisis among the supporters of free markets in the West today. I think that the end of history was a very powerful moment, but in many respects parts of the British right and American right live in a sort of an extended 1990s where we think the triumphant victory of 1989 will be with us forever and we don't have to do anything about it. McDonald's opened in Moscow and then we can put our feet up. But as you might know, McDonald's is now closed in Moscow and it's been renamed, probably given a Russian patriotic name now. So the forces against free markets are actually on the march around, but they are also against us in Britain, which is what we want to go through today. Free markets have been the greatest agent of prosperity in human history, but they have many enemies. Despite being a notionally capitalist and free market country, it is hard to say that Britain operates such an economy today. In the 21st century, Parliament has decided to fetter and constrain our economy in umpteen ways. Not only is it functionally impossible to build new houses, towns or factories, the state even prescribes what sort of windows and doors and we'll go into them and how they must look like. Who remembers when Ebbsfleet in Kent was going to be a new commuter town on the high-speed rail link to London and even to Paris because it sits on the Eurostar? Well, those dreams died in 2021 because Ebbsfleet's development and density was halted because of the discovery of rare spiders. It is very, very interesting that human flourishing and human prosperity are being held up in the interest of spiders, but this really is the way in which the British economy runs itself right now, and it paints a much bigger picture, which is of great concern to all supporters of free markets. We have a web of legal duties, some dating from our time in the European Union, but plenty more created by our own parliament, and these have hobbled our ability to maintain and build our industrial base. We sit on great natural resources under the North Sea, shale gas under our feet in the north of England, and even abundant oil underneath the Falklands in the developed world. Something clearly isn't matching up here right now. Why is it that American energy is, industrial energy is a third of the price of Britain's? And we say that Britain, for some reason, shouldn't have an industrial economy, or we should go to services only. We've essentially made having an industrial economy illegal. Maybe we should try and make it legal first and then work out what we'd be good at. Now, of course, the picture isn't all doom and gloom. There are pockets of excitement and innovation in the British economy, and areas where Britain is a genuine world leader. We remain near at the front of the pack in financial and professional services, and the country's growing artificial intelligence sector is near the globe's technological frontier. Look at the genuine world-beating innovation happening in London and Cambridge in particular. The product of British intelligence, American investment, huge levels of innovation. That really is free markets and human flourishing and human ingenuity at their finest, and we should be proud of that. And actually there has been some better news this week. New laws have been passed which will allow the deployment of driverless cars on Britain's roads, and the government has wisely fended off calls to regulate the British AI sector in the way that the European Union is doing. So thankfully we may well have dodged a bullet here. We're going to discuss about lots of bullets that Britain's not dodging, but we can say for one, we are in the process of dodging the bullet on regulating AI, and free markets and innovation are being respected. But we should never be complacent, we should never consider ourselves out of the woods. There is an entire network, an entire blob of people coming after these sectors. Innovators are considered threats, and people like the Legartman Institute, the Adam Smith Institute, the Austrian Economics Centre always need to guard against this, so we should never be complacent. Let us just hope on that note that Parliament keeps the Competition and Markets Authority in its box for the time being, lest it finds another sector that is deemed a bit too exciting and has to be snuffed out. A good case in point here is they've decided to come after the partnerships that some large tech companies are striking with AI research foundations, and they've decided that that might be an antitrust violation. If ChatGPT is going to be banned because the Competition and Markets Authority doesn't like it, I think we have to have an entire rethink of what role the Competition and Markets Authority plays, particularly with our democracy. Anyway, to this morning's panellists. We'll be joined by the people that are going to help put this right. We have Maxwell Marlow, Research Director of the Adam Smith Institute, and the Right Honourable Robert Jenrick, Conservative MP for Newark. Maxwell is one of the co-organisers of today's event. Previously of Hanbury Strategy, where he specialised in working with companies in the financial services sector, today he leads the ASI's research output. Recent papers include Pulling Out All the Stops, How Government Can Go for Growth and Cut the Cost of Living, which advocated a range of free market solutions, which the audience here will surely support, like raising income tax thresholds, ending the ban on fracking, and ending England's absurdly tight regulations on childcare. We can all agree with those. So welcome Maxwell to the Legatum Institute, where he'll give us the ASI view on the things holding back the British economy and how to get rid of them. Maxwell, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to start with something that seems quite trivial, the cost of a chicken. So back in 1971, you could go to the shop and buy yourself a chicken. If you were to apply the house price index to that chicken in 1971 and get it today, a chicken would cost £83, which is absurd when you think of the cost of housing. Housing, we're believers at the Amherst Institute in the housing theory of everything. If you don't fix the planning system to build more houses, to build more factories, to build more lab space, to build more roads, more power stations, you name it, you can't fix growth. Now, it should also not surprise you that when you look at the state of our pollution, for example, it's mainly concentrated in areas that aren't specifically urban. That's mainly because where we build our houses, they seem to be in the suburbs. So we decided to go ahead with a study actually the first study in the world to look at the costs of the British economy, costs on the British economy of not densifying in urban areas. It wasn't £100 million it cost the British economy per year in growth. It wasn't 10 billion. It was £160 billion a year in lost growth because we refused to densify in urban areas. It's all down to one culprit. A culprit which, people such as the CPRE, the Campaign to Protect Rural England, the Green Party, the Liberal Democrats even, say exists purely to stop us from building on the Green Belt. That Green Belt they think of as, Bambi, deers running across the fields, little bunnies and all sorts of old English ideas of the countryside. It's not. It's car parks, it's disused petrol stations, disused factories. The entire reason this was put in place, the Town and Country Planning Act 1947, was in order to strangle growth. If you read the Hansard debates that were around at the time discussing this piece of legislation, it purely exists to stop the expansion of cities because they were scared of urban sprawl. When you look at America, for example, this isn't a problem. I mean, they have falling rents, falling house prices, and ever higher growth. There are bus drivers in Atlanta that are paid more than the Prime Minister. Shocking. But that's what we could have if we chose to go for growth and scrap the Town and Country Planning Act. And again, it all comes down to housing and planning. And I was very thankful to work with JL Partners, actually, to do some polling on this. And when you ask most people, they don't want to build new towns. They don't want to build, these strange boxes that happen because we've constrained, as Fred said earlier, the way we design our houses. People want to expand on their existing communities with building beautifully in areas that people want to live in, which actually seems to be near to where they grew up. That is the economy we have at the moment, where you're just not permitted to do that, and you must live in, as we can see in international comparisons, the dampest, the smallest, the most expensive living space in Europe. It doesn't have to be this way. A lot of the growth we find in the British economy at the moment just does seem to be, purely value add. A lot of it is, the size of our housing sector. If you take the gross value of all businesses in the UK and you take the gross value of all property, it's 3 to 1. So that means that our housing sector is 3 times more value than all of the productive companies in this country. In America, it's 1 to 1. And who's growing? It's not us.
Thank you very much, Maxwell. Now, so our star panellists this morning. We have Robert Jenrick, who's been MP for Newark since his victorious by-election campaign in 2014. Former Secretary of State for Housing and an Immigration Minister in 2023 and 2022, he became one of the most significant voices for the free market reform in the Conservative Party today. You will have seen his important work on immigration, which he published recently with the Centre for Policy Studies think tank, and his campaigning to enact and deliver a properly functional asylum system during his time in office and on the backbenchers. He has shown how Britain's immigration policy over the last few years has harmed British prosperity, and he has offered a way to solve this. Before that, he was Housing Secretary and was one of the most passionate advocates for exactly the principles Maxwell discussed about how to the discretion and the unpredictability from our planning system and give Britain a rules-based, pro-growth, pro-prosperity, but also a planning system, but also one which allows families to form and families to flourish in the homes that they need. We haven't quite got there yet, but we believe at Legatum Institute that it is entirely possible. Today, Robert is here to talk about the other problems holding back the British economy, drawing partly on his time as Housing Secretary, and will address them with us today. Robert, please.
Brilliant. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Fred. Thank you, Radomir, for this invitation. It's lovely to be back at Legatum, which I actually came to 10 years ago for the first time, immediately after I was elected, when my first job, if you can call it in British politics, was as the bag carrier to Michael Gove. And we came here to talk about how we're going to reform the prisons. So you can see how well that's gone. But hopefully today's discussion will be more fruitful, and we'll be able to make some progress. And the argument I've been trying to make in recent years, both as Housing Secretary and then latterly on immigration, comes together in the insight that I think our economic model is essentially broken. The model that we have enjoyed, that we have lived with for 30 years is simply not working. And there are many threads that run through that. But two are that mass migration, mass low-skilled migration, is not driving economic growth. And secondly, which I'd like to talk about more today,
Absolutely.
the spiralling energy prices that we have and have had in this country for the last 20 years are holding us back. And those two coming together, mass migration and out of control, uncompetitive energy, is making this country poorer. And you can see that in the statistics. In the last 20 years, industrial electricity prices have risen more than threefold. The amount of mass immigration we've had has also risen exponentially. In the 25 years since 1997, net migration to this country has been 5.9 million. In the 25 years prior to 1997, it was just 68,000. And how's the economy performed in this period? Well, we've had the lowest productivity growth in this country since the Industrial Revolution for more than 200 years. And we've had economic growth averaging around 1.2%. Today we would kill for 1.2% economic growth. But that is not the way to make a sustainable, rich, affluent, prosperous society, which is what everyone in this room and everybody in the country wants to see. So I think on both of these fronts and others, we have to do something fundamentally different. And I have tried to argue that the first step in that is to get control over our immigration system and to build something which is highly selective, where we are the grammar school of the Western world, not a country that is closing its doors to the best and the brightest, but is thinking carefully about who we want to bring into this country, who will genuinely drive economic growth, who will be net economic contributors to this country, and who above all will make our own citizens wealthier, healthier, happier. And that means a different system to the one that we have had for most of my adult life. But that isn't enough. And the discussion I think today is not primarily about that. It's about other things that we can and should do. And one of them I think is to change our energy model. For at least the last 20 years, it's clearly not working. It is making us poorer. It is leading to high levels of energy prices for our own citizens. And that, of course, has come home to roost most prominently since 2021, when we've had this energy spiral, which has both meant that our own citizens have had to pay far more for their energy, and the state has intervened in a way which is unprecedented in modern history, making it so much more challenging to reduce the size of the state, to do the tax cuts that most of us, I think, here would like to see. But in particular, the policies that we have pursued in recent years have led to a degradation of our industrial base. And that worries me on many different levels. It worries me because I believe we have to reindustrialize as a country. We've got to ensure that we have those jobs and investment here in the country. I think we are far too economically unequal as a country, far too much focused here in London and the South East. And if you believe in the mission that was once known as levelling up, then you've got to have an industrial base in all parts of the United Kingdom. And I also worry that we are essentially losing our strategic industries to our adversaries elsewhere in the world. For example, we're trading dependence on Russian hydrocarbons for dependence on cheap Chinese electric vehicles in something which even the Biden administration in the United States now seems to have perhaps belatedly woken up to with some of the actions that it's been taking in recent weeks. So we've got to change that. How do we begin to do this? And that, I think, cuts to some of the points that have already been made. At the heart of this is our planning system. And I hope we get on to talking about housing because that's something that I care about very strongly. But it also speaks to the energy challenge that we face. We are smothering our ability to build new nuclear power stations at Hinkley, the biggest construction site in Europe today. Our regulator for nuclear has insisted on 7,000 design modifications merely for marine life. The environmental impact assessment for how we handle fish has run to 30,000 pages. We have asked the proponents of that scheme to make changes which will cost tens, perhaps even hundreds of millions of pounds to protect as few fish as a single trawler might capture in a year. And this, after all, is a project which is supposed to reduce emissions and protect the environment in the long term, but of course there's no balance in the way in which we're pursuing this. And then our fledgling second project at Sizewell C is going to be even more burdensome and over-regulated than the one that we're already pursuing. And the planning application for that is, I think, already 3 times larger than the one in Somerset. This is not a way in which to run our economy. It's not a way in which to take forward net zero or any sensible energy policy. So I think we have to radically change our planning system, restore balance and common sense to it so that we can meet the needs of our population. I think if we don't do this, to summarise, we are going to put immense pressures on our own citizens, making their lives more difficult with ever-rising energy bills. We are going to make it impossible to reindustrialise our economy. We're going to continue to lose strategically important industries, which is the wrong thing for our country, the wrong thing for our energy security in the years ahead. And that is a price I'm not willing to pay. And I think we as Conservatives, as free market advocates who want to see Britain, like other great countries around the world, fighting fit for the future, have to take action to change this. Thank you.
Robert, Maxwell, thank you very much for your opening remarks. Now I'd like to move to questions. As the chairman, I will certainly start with a few of my own, but then some hands are already bouncing up out in the audience, which is a very exciting sign. So we will have some microphones. Please don't speak until you've been given a microphone, otherwise you won't be picked up. But we'll see how many questions we can get through. I'd like to start with one or two, though, for both Robert and Maxwell. But Robert, the Labour leader has come up with the concept of grey belt to describe parts of the green belt which are all sort of ugly, sort of low, light industry, wasteland, scrubland, the sort of stuff that probably populates plenty of areas of all over England. I don't know how much green belt there is in Newark, but it's the sort of stuff we know that none.
We don't have green belts.
Oh, very good. But this isn't. He has identified the grey belt as an area for priority building. Do you think the Labour Party are correct here? Would you advocate a similar grey belt designation and zone it for growth?
Well, I don't think there's any substance to the Labour Party's policy on this. I don't mean that, well, I do mean it disparagingly, but I don't. I want them to succeed. I want everybody ultimately to be pro-growth and pro-housing and development. And if there are converts to that, I'll take them from whichever corner they come. But that particular policy is essentially the one we have today, which is that a local council can say that there is a particular part of the Greenbelt which does not really meet any normal definition of the Greenbelt and could be taken out of it and put for development use. So I don't think that's a radical departure. That's something that successive Secretary of State, myself, Sajid Javid, others advocated and encouraged councils to think very carefully and to use their democratic voice to determine places that could be fit for development. I don't think that will be the magic bullet in this issue. I do think that the real core of the challenge is the fact that our planning system is so unpredictable, that it does not encourage investors, it doesn't encourage developers, particularly new entrants to the market. We in the UK have a system which is so heavily focused on a small number of major developers, which is quite different to other countries, quite different to the United States. We've got to create a system which is more predictable, rules-based, one in which new entrants can come in and thrive. And if you can do that, then I think you'll find that it's much easier. And that's what I advocated when I was Housing Secretary. I advocated a move to essentially a zonal form of planning. I still think that's the right approach. There are baby steps on the way to that, if that is deemed to be more radical. But simply having the state determine every aspect of the process and it be highly unpredictable is not the right route forward.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Robert. Maxwell, do you have any comments on the grey belt concept?
I think it's trying to square a circle. As we've already mentioned, Britain is plagued by two types of the anti-growth coalition. NIMBYs, not in my backyard, and bananas, build absolutely nothing near anyone. The grey belt, I think, squares off the NIMBYs quite well. And I'll reference the polling again we did with jail partners. It's called Rooms for Debate, if anyone's interested in looking at it. We essentially look at this and say, yes, actually, people do want to develop on the brownfield sites, the grey belt, whatever the latest term is. There is one problem with that, though. It's expensive to develop on brownfield sites. You have to, as Robert's already said, it's onerous regulations on the environment. It means we have to have very high spec cleanups. These are incredibly expensive. Something I co-wrote with Priced Out recently, it's called Boosting Brownfield. We looked at applying the full expensing idea to brownfield cleanup, basically saying if you can basically expense the costs of cleanup on your corporation tax bill over 5 years, and we found that would make actually a 7% return for the Treasury. Which music to the Treasury's ears, I hope. Unfortunately, it was dynamic modelling, so they probably won't look at it. They like their accounting static models, which are rubbish, but hey-ho. We send that off, but it seems okay. But that's what the big challenge is, the finance, rather than getting it done. Robert also spoke about the size of house builders. The latest NPPF reforms were, they're okay. The big issue, though, is you've essentially created an oligopoly. We're seeing large house builders now start to merge in order to utilise their scale to overcome these very challenging planning regulations. 75% of house builders since 1997 are now bust. And you can't solve the housing crisis with just this oligopolistic model. You need to utilise SME, small, medium-sized enterprises who go out, develop and build. The current planning system destroys that. It doesn't really have any care for it. And I think the overall point really is brownfield, greyfield site isn't going to solve the housing crisis without fundamental reform to the number one culprit, the Town and Country Planning Act. I shiver every time I say it. It's a terrible piece of legislation, probably one of the worst we've ever passed. That needs to go, or else you do not solve the problems.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do one more question of mine, and then I've already got at least 3 people in the audience who have caught my eye, now 4th. So, Maxwell first, then Robert. Can you politically justify the sort of building you're proposing with our current immigration policy?
One to ask the Adam Smith Institute.
Indeed, one to ask the Adam Smith Institute.
I will give a hint to future research that Robert may quite like. We're looking at the immigration system again and not taking the previous ways of doing things. I think the dial has shifted. you can't, unfortunately, justify the current amount of immigration with the planning system the way it is. The amazing statistics, the mind-boggling statistics Robert's pointed out on our immigration system, if you're not having the growth, if you're not having the growth in housing units, you can't compete, unfortunately. And I think it's very, very dangerous to start pitting people who are born here with immigrants over housing space, even when it is so competitive to get a place. We're essentially looking at a multi-housing system, or preferably both. Then you're in for a seriously bad time.
Much. Robert.
Well, look, when I was Housing Secretary, as a result of a lot of work since 2010 under a series of Secretary of State who cared passionately about house building, like Greg Clark and Sajid Javid, the number of homes being built in this country reached around 250,000 per year, which was the highest since 1987. It's fallen substantially since then, due to some external factors, but also some bad decisions. That is far too few homes, even to meet our domestic needs, let alone if you then have the levels of what I would argue mass legal migration that we've seen in recent years. To build enough homes in England alone to house the number of people who came into this country legally last year, we would have to be building a new home every 5 minutes, night and day, 365 days a year. Now that's clearly impossible. There's no way, with the best will in the world, if we could do all the planning reforms that everybody in this room might advocate, we could ever create a system that was able to do that. That's just not reasonable. It's also not in any sense planned. And if you're going to invite, like we did last year, 1.2 million people into this country, you have to think about the roads, the GPs, the dentists, which we haven't done. And so I think you have to get a grip on the numbers of people coming into the country. That's why I advocate both substantial reductions in the numbers, but then also of the people who do come, a much more selective system. So you choose the people who you think are really going to drive the country forwards economically. But even if you fix that problem, clearly we have to go much further in the number of homes that we're building merely to help our domestic population to live in decent quality homes in the places they really want to live, to have labour mobility so they can travel for work and for all the things that life brings them. And that means a massive step change in the number of homes that we're building and the sorts of reforms that I've advocated and Adam Smith Institute and others have as well. I sense that there is a degree of understanding of the scale of the challenge in politics today, but not yet the political will to actually do this. I live in hope this is generational, and that as more politicians come up who are experiencing what young people in this country are experiencing, not even frankly today the inability to buy a home, but the amount of their salaries that they are using up on rent, 40% of salary on rent, that we will finally get a new generation of political leaders seized with this issue who will take it forwards. And I do look at some lodestars elsewhere in the world, like the Canadian Conservatives, for example, who have managed to speak about these issues in a way which is compelling, which is winning over new audiences for conservatism, particularly amongst young people, and appears to be on the cusp of power and the ability to put these ideas into practice. And one of the things that interests me about what the Canadian Conservatives are doing is that they do speak about issues like immigration in a way which is actually appealing to a younger generation, because they speak about it through the lens of the cost of living, the impact on the housing crisis, and the fact that in parts of Canada, just like I would argue here in the UK, the housing crisis is as much an immigration crisis as a supply crisis for new homes. So that I think is the argument that we need to make, to reframe the argument and to ensure that we can persuade the next generation of our leaders to take this forwards.
Thank you very much, Robert. I'm very pleased with your reference to Canada at the end. So we will turn to questions. So I'm going to start with Jake Scott, then Claire Cummings, and then Alex Morton. Can the three of you make yourself known to Susie, and then we'll do another round. So Jake, please go.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm not sure if this is... Oh, there we go. Thank you so much for the questions and answers. In the lead up to the 2016 Brexit vote, one of the statistics that was trotted out frequently was that it took 6,000 words to regulate the sale of bananas across the EU. This was actually close to about 20,000, but even that pales in comparison to the figures you were quoting there, Mr. Jenrick, about the amendments being made to the Hinkley Point nuclear plant. I think I anticipate Maxwell's answer to this question, but the question really I had was, do you think that the over-regulation of planning, etc., is a consequence of Brussels-style bureaucracy poisoning the British system, or is there a deeper, more long-term malaise that we need to identify and address in order for these constellation of problems to be undone?
Great question, Jake. Robert?
Well, I'm not sure if it's a Brussels-style issue. I think the Brits are perfectly capable of inventing bureaucracy themselves. And maybe it takes inspiration from what's happening in the EU. We clearly have to have a fundamentally different approach, don't we, to the way in which we do regulation on a whole range of different areas. And that is very prominent in the planning system, but it's not exclusive to the planning system. It is meaning within planning that there is a growing challenge to build anything, frankly, in this country today. Whether that's a reservoir in a part of the country where there are droughts, whether it's the Lower Thames crossing where we appear to have spent £300 million on the planning phase alone of a tunnel which, well, at least when it began, was broadly popular with the public who wanted an easier way of getting across the Thames. Whether it's new lab spaces around Oxford and Cambridge, where, as Fred said in his introduction, we've got one of the world's greatest emergent industries, but yet some of its proponents can't build the premises that they need to prosper. So I think you've got to adopt this, and you've got to change this. There's a couple of things that... The system itself is clearly far too bureaucratic, and you've got to cut through the red tape and simplify it by going back to first principles about what is this really all about. That was at the heart of the changes that I tried to make to the planning system, where you go back to, if you want a plan-based system, not everybody does, but if you want a plan-based system, what should this really be about? Well, it needs to be simple and understandable to the public, where you could look up a plan and see where can you build, what are the rules, keep those rules as simple as possible, rather than have this proliferation, which actually makes it impossible for anybody to navigate at all. And often doesn't achieve the outcomes that it set out to achieve in the first place. I mean, I'm not at all sure that the 7,000 design modifications at Hinkley will make it a substantially safer environment or will improve the marine environment. I think incidentally there, we should be looking to adopt some of the rules and regulations of other respected regulators around the world. I don't think that we have to reinvent the rule book if South Korea or France or the United States has perfectly good nuclear regulation. We can coalesce, as we're trying to do in other spheres like pharmaceuticals, for example. But I think it's trying to return to first principles. And for Parliament, it is breaking through this mesh of regulations, which is always driven by the desire to meet the day-to-day, where you've got charities, NGOs, campaign groups, always campaigning for things which may be individually well-meaning, but collectively is stifling for the economy. And it takes strength from ministers to say no to those things. Absolutely. Because you might have, a member of the royal family writing to you saying that, you should have bird bricks in every new home. And you think, well, that sounds a lovely idea. Of course we'd like that. But if you adopt 1,000 versions of that, then the cost of a new home for a young person is £10,000 more than it was when you started out. And so I think it does require a degree of kind of clear-sighted leadership to keep this under control.
You referenced Brexit. what was the famous thing with Brexit? Take back control. And something we've definitely seen with the culture essentially in politics recently is giving power to quangos to regulate the economy and then stepping back and going, that's for them, not for us. And what is it? If anyone here has done any political economy and they've looked at the Virginia School of Political Economy, they know one thing, that quangos and regulators want to do one thing, is to give themselves more power. And that is exactly what they do. They just want to expand. So if you're looking for a job at the moment, it's a great time to be a lawyer because you've got lots of regulations to go through, or a great time to be a regulator because no one's getting in your way. It's indicative, essentially, of this, this culture that Robert's talked about. Ministers feel disempowered or aren't empowered enough to really crack down on regulators getting away from first principles. So we do need to have a fundamental rethink, essentially. I mean, speaking to Charles, who's a fellow at the Adam Smith Institute, formerly running a bank, number one thing, we discuss FCA regulation, or it's PRU, or it's the Bank of England, or there are hundreds of regulators, all growing and all stifling. So I think, come back to your foremost point, about Brexit and the cost of a banana. It's bananas that we haven't taken back control of regulators. It's just nuts. So definitely something to review.
Yeah, just one thing I'd say, just reflecting on some of the planning reforms we did do a few years back. There was a lot of noise around them, but it's hard to think of any of them now which anyone talks about, because once they'd actually happened, they appear to have worked, and everybody's perfectly happy about them. So, to give you a few examples, there was once a system whereby if you wanted to turn a particular type of shop into another one, or a shop into a cafe, you'd have to apply for planning permission for this under what was called the use class order, which was a sort of intricate planning system. We decided to scrap that and turn it into just a few very simple classes. So you could turn your hairdressers into a cafe, into a charity shop. You could convert it into a home if it had been empty for 3 months. There was an outcry about this from everyone from the National Trust to the CPRE to the Local Government Association. This was going to be a free-for-all on the high street. It was going to destroy high streets. We just went ahead with it. Do you hear anyone talking about this today? No. So obviously not all deregulation is successful, but it often is, and you just have to have the courage to cut through the noise, get on and do it if you believe it's the right thing to do, and invariably it does actually succeed, and then in a few years' time you're reaping the economic benefits of it.
Thank you very much. So Claire Cummings from the Centre for Digital Assets and Democracy.
Yes, thank you very much. You've been very eloquent, Mr. Jenrick, about the current dire and strangled situation. This has come about after 9 years of Conservative majority rule. Why have you let it happen?
Well, I haven't let it happen, is in fairness.
The Conservative majority rule has let it happen.
Nobody could have fought harder for planning reform than I did when I was Housing Secretary, and I resigned from Cabinet because I disagreed with what was happening with our immigration system. So with all due respect, I think I can defend my own record on this. But I'm not here for the government. I'm here to set out my own views. But I take your point. But not all is gloomy. Some things I think have progressed, but more quite clearly needs to happen. I mean, that is our argument here, that some of the reforms which did happen, for example, on housing, I think have stalled, and we've got to re-energise, regroup, and make these arguments once again. I also think the challenges facing the country are much clearer today than even 10 years ago. I do think there are parallels to the 1970s today, where the country, like some others, are facing huge systemic challenges, whether that is from an age of mass migration posing huge problems for developed countries, energy challenges, rising adversaries elsewhere in the world risking our security, the low productivity that we've experienced. And that does require people of our point of view, people who believe in free markets and conservatism, to think very carefully and have better answers to the challenges facing this country than the ones I think the right of British politics has today. That is the root of some of the challenges. We ultimately haven't delivered on all of our promises. We don't have good enough answers to the problems facing the country.
Maxwell, your thoughts on the Conservative Party? Then we'll go to Alex's question.
Well, I'm obviously not speaking on behalf of, only on behalf of the Adam Smith Institute. I think it's been a real shame to see, a very strong party, the party of Margaret Thatcher, let us remember, go towards the centre and go towards the left and expand the size of the state and expand taxes. I know Robert's been, in the trenches, bayonet fixed, against some of these, huge challenges that have just kind of grown the state over time, and hopefully, you can take back control. I'll keep referencing it, but it's a great line. Well done, Dominic Cummings. But I think hopefully you can take back control of that. Adam Smith Institute launched the Next Generation Centre, which you'll hear more about later. It's not for the Conservative Party, it's for all of politics and all policymakers, and we're taking people from across the board to try and re-energise the idea of free markets and of liberty. And we're not conservatives, we're neoliberals, and really trying to re-energise neoliberalism, that vaunted phrase you hear being thrown about from left to right. But we're really focused on getting liberty back on track, and that's really for us. So best of luck to the Tories, but we'll keep doing our thing on the side.
Thank you very much. Alex Morton, question from him, and then hopefully we'll have maybe time for one more after the answers.
Hello, Alex Morton from the Centre for Policy Studies, and I wrote a report in 2010 called Making Housing Affordable that argued our economy and society was screwed unless we fixed the planning system, which unfortunately we haven't. Although Robert did a few good reforms. People have done a few good reforms quite along the way, but it hasn't added up to the fundamental change we need. But my question is a slightly friendlier version, perhaps, of the second one, where I'm quite sympathetic to the emotion, but I'm sort of phrasing it in a hopefully more forward-looking way, which is, what does a pro-growth Conservative Party look like? So assuming that the Labour Party will not become a party of growth, and I think they will try, but they'll find it very difficult, it's not their DNA. What does a pro-growth Conservative Party look like?
Robert?
Well, I think there's a few big challenges that we've got to confront. One is housing, which we've rehearsed today, and that, as has been said, cuts to many different things. So we've got to have a fundamentally different and more ambitious approach to building homes and the planning system. I don't incidentally think that were there to be a Labour government, they would grapple with this. I thought what Angela Rayner has proposed today on new towns seems to be incredibly unambitious. Doing a handful of small housing extensions over the next 10 to 20 years is not the solution to this problem, although it would be welcome. I think the second area is around energy, and that is taking a far more realistic approach to net zero than the one we have to date. I don't think that policymakers and politicians have understood just what an eye-wateringly big change net zero is, which fundamentally sets out to rewire our entire economy and the way that it has been based since the Industrial Revolution. The costs have not been thought through to the extent that they have been astronomical, and we've got to adopt far more pragmatism in the way we approach that challenge. I'm pleased that that dialogue in this country has started to change somewhat in the last year or two, but there's a lot further that we should be doing there. I think we have to do more on welfare reform, because I worry that we are living in a country where you now have almost 10 million people who are economically inactive, almost 1 million people who are on some form of out-of-work benefits. And you can't be serious about tackling legal migration, reducing it, without being serious about welfare reform if you believe in a pro-growth attitude. And so I think that has to once again be at the heart of a Conservative agenda. And then I do think on immigration, as I've sought to make the argument over the last year or two, we've got to have a different attitude where we try to bring in the best and the brightest from the world, but we don't have this tap open that we've had now for too long of businesses reaching for the easy lever of low-skilled, low-wage migration, rather than investing in the skills of our domestic population, on new technology, and driving genuine productivity growth in this country. Those seem to me to be ways in which we can be distinctly conservative, because they are not things, I suspect, that a Labour government or a socialist government would take forward in this country. But it will require real ambition, because I do not believe that tinkering on any of those fronts will be sufficient to turn around our economy. We are living through a period of incredibly low economic growth and productivity growth, as we said at the start. We as Conservatives have to have a much more radical agenda on each of those and other things to take the country forwards.
Right, Max, quick comment, then we'll do one question with 4 minutes remaining.
The number one thing I want the Tories to concentrate on is productivity growth. The productivity growth stalled in this country in 2007, so it was even before the great financial crash. So it's an endemic problem that's been kind of going on for some time, and that's the number one thing I would love the Tories just to crack. I'll bring back to the point about the bus driver in Atlanta, who earns more than the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, more than the fifth largest economy in the world. They have cracked the productivity puzzle. We're working out how to do that in the UK, but when we fix it, please, for the love of God, do it.
And we'll field one last question from the audience. Catherine McBride here. And quick answers, quick question, please.
Robert, I wanted to bring this back to energy because I think that's the key, and it was part of your speech, though I love housing. You talked about in the nuclear program, and nuclear is fantastic and we need a lot more of it, but it's only about 20 to 25% of the total energy use in the UK. Fossil fuels is the major supplier still of our heating and our transport, and we need more of it. And yet your government is taxing oil and gas at 75%. I know you're not in it anymore, but you sat there while they did that, and they've done that until 2028, which is not exactly a windfall tax. That's a tax. That's just a real tax, That's not going away, and Labor's not going to get it anywhere. How is it economic to import liquid natural gas from the US to run our power stations when you're at the same time telling everyone to get an electric car, get an electric heat pump, the key's in the name, electric. You need more and more electric. Not only is our immigration low wage and low skilled, they're low energy. Humans are much more energy efficient than robots. If we want to move into productivity, you are going to need 30 times as much power as we've got now. Yeah. How are you going to fix that?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Catherine. Great question. So, in 2 minutes, let's do Maxwell 30 seconds, then we'll give Robert 90.
Right. I know where I am. Okay. Great. Completely agree. I'm still mad keen on nuclear. Our big issue, I'll come back to the chickens I started my opening remarks with. I want a chicken on every table and an SMR in every backyard. That's where we want to be. The problem is that our regulatory state, as we've touched on extensively now, is so vicious that Rolls-Royce now curtailing their programme. So if we don't fix that, we're done for.
Thanks very much, Max. Robert.
Yeah, well, your point about robots is very apt, because the UK has, I think, the lowest uptake of robots of any major economy in the Western world. And no doubt there are many reasons for that. But two I would give you are high electricity costs and abundant supply of low-wage mass migration, which means that businesses don't even need to, even if they could afford to adopt them. And so I think that is a good example of where we're going wrong and why we're not driving up our productivity. Look, I have great sympathy with you with respect to the so-called windfall tax. The virtue that we had with our regulatory and fiscal approach to North Sea oil and gas for many years was consistent approach which the industry could believe in and have the confidence to invest in. That was approach that George Osborne set out as Chancellor when he published a document which gave the industry a degree of confidence to make long-standing, 10, 20, 30-year decisions. I fear we have lost that now. and damaged our North Sea oil and gas sector. Like many others, I would like that to be reversed and us to have a more attractive fiscal environment for those businesses to invest in the UK. But the first step, I think, well, beyond that, is to help business to build new nuclear, build gas-fired power stations. It's frankly absurd that we live in a country where we've been talking about building small nuclear reactors for at least 10 years. We have a design which is British. We have a world-class business in Rolls-Royce that could build them, and there's not been a single spade in the ground. Let's hope we can get on and do that. But anything we can do to reduce the regulatory burden will help.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you very much, Maxwell, for a great conversation. We're going to break for coffee now.